The crack of my mother's hand across my face echoed through the family restaurant like a thunderclap on a clear day. I stood there, frozen, tasting copper where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek, feeling the burns spread across my left cheekbone. 43 customers, 17 staff members, and my entire family witnessed Deepa Malhotra, the woman who'd raised me, strike me in public because I dared to speak a truth no one wanted to hear. My younger sister Priya had just signed a partnership agreement that would destroy our family's restaurant empire within 6 months, and I was the villain for pointing it out. "You're fired, Mira," my mother said, her voice cold enough to frost glass. "Pack your things and get out of my restaurant. You've always been jealous of your sister's vision, always trying to drag her down, because you can't stand that she's more creative than you'll ever be." I stood there in the middle of our flagship location, the Golden Saffron, wearing the chef's whites I'd earned through 15 years of 80-hour weeks and endless sacrifice. My cheek throbbed, my heart pounded, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief that no one else noticed, I smiled, because they had no idea what I'd been planning for the past 2 years. "Fine," I said. One word. No tears, no arguments, no begging, just fine. The next morning, Priya practically danced into my office, ready to celebrate my humiliation. Instead, she found it completely empty. Every file, every recipe notebook, every photograph of my achievements, gone. Just a single envelope on the bare desk. My resignation letter. That's when our family's accountant burst through the door, his face the color of spoiled milk. "The partnership contract, it's been canceled. The suppliers say they'll only work with Mira, and that's not all." What my mother didn't know was that I wasn't just the head chef and operations manager. I was the only reason our 5 restaurants were still standing. The secret recipes everyone thought were family heirlooms, I'd perfected them. The supplier relationships that kept our costs low, I'd built them personally. The staff loyalty that made our service legendary, I'd earned it through respect, not authority. And I just walked away from all of it. My name is Mira Sharma. I'm 36 years old. And until 15 minutes ago, I was the backbone of Malhotra Restaurant Group, the company my grandmother started 40 years ago with nothing but a pressure cooker and a dream. I've spent the last 15 years of my life holding this empire together with skill, endless nights, and the kind of quiet competence that gets overlooked when you have a younger sister who's louder, flashier, and better at making everything look effortless. The slap echoed through our flagship restaurant like a gunshot. I'd walked into that family meeting knowing it would be difficult. Priya had done it again. Signed a contract she barely understood, dazzled by promises of expansion and celebrity chef partnerships without bothering to read the actual terms. A supposedly exclusive partnership with Freshmart, a corporate food supplier that would lock us into purchasing agreements we couldn't possibly meet, with penalty clauses that would financially destroy us if we failed. I'd spent 72 sleepless hours with our accountant and senior managers, running the numbers, building the case, preparing the presentation that would prove what everyone needed to hear. This partnership would bankrupt Malhotra Restaurant Group within 18 months. My mother sat at the head of the private dining table, the same table where my grandmother used to test new recipes and teach me how to balance spices by instinct rather than measurement. Her silver hair was pulled back in the elegant bun she'd worn for 30 years. Her expression was already set in that familiar mask of dismissive certainty. Deepa Malhotra had always been obsessed with status, not the kind built through culinary excellence or customer loyalty, but the performative kind that looked good in food magazines and sounded impressive at social gatherings. To her right sat Priya, my 28-year-old sister, wearing a designer sari she'd charged to the company card and an expression of practiced confidence that had never quite been backed by actual competence. The other family members filled the remaining seats. My uncle Rajesh, who'd worked alongside my grandmother and was one of the few people in that room with an actual conscience. My Aunt Kavita, our financial manager, who'd been steadily graying since Priya joined the management team 3 years ago, and 4 cousins who'd long ago perfected the art of seeing only what was convenient. I stood near the presentation screen, tablet in hand, my burgundy silk kurta pressed to perfection. Every strand of dark hair pulled into the neat braid I'd learned made people take me more seriously. I walked them through the financial projections, the timeline analysis, the comparative data from similar partnerships in the industry. My voice remained level, professional, stripped of anything that could be called emotional, as I explained exactly how Priya's signature on that contract had potentially destroyed everything our family had built. The penalty clauses alone, I said, highlighting the relevant section on screen, would trigger cascading financial obligations of approximately 12 crore rupees if we miss a single supply milestone. Priya committed us to a 6-month delivery schedule for menu standardization across all 5 locations that our kitchen teams estimate requires 12 to 18 months to implement properly. Mira's just being conservative, Priya interrupted, her voice carrying that same breezy confidence she used to charm investors before I had to quietly clean up the damage. Freshmart loved my vision for modern Indian fusion. They specifically said they wanted to work with someone who thinks big instead of someone who's stuck in grandmother's kitchen. I kept my tone neutral, though I saw Priya's cheeks flush. Priya, you promised them a standardized menu system with specifications that eliminate 70% of our signature dishes, the very dishes that built our reputation over 4 decades. My mother's hand came down on the table hard enough to rattle the water glasses. That's enough, Mira. Your sister secured the biggest partnership in company history, and all you can do is tear her down, just like always. I'd heard variations of this accusation my entire life, so the words themselves didn't surprise me. What caught my attention was the specific phrasing, just like always, which matched almost verbatim something I'd seen in an email Priya had accidentally forwarded to me 6 months ago. Advice from someone she called a family friend and mentor, whose name she'd never mentioned. Someone who seemed to have my mother's ear as well, judging by how often her criticisms echoed that mysterious advisor's language. I'm not tearing her down, I said quietly. I'm trying to save this company from a contractual obligation we cannot fulfill. You're trying to make your sister look incompetent because you're threatened by her success. My mother leaned forward, and I saw something ugly flicker in her eyes. Something that had been building for years, fed by whispers I couldn't trace. Priya has vision. Priya has courage. All you have is recipes and routines. Uncle Rajesh cleared his throat. Deepa, perhaps we should review Mira's analysis before We don't need to review anything except Mira's attitude. My mother stood, and the room went very quiet. I'm tired of you sabotaging your sister. I'm tired of your jealousy poisoning this family. I could have argued. I had 43 slides of irrefutable data. I had emails from our head chef explicitly stating the timeline was impossible. I had legal opinions from 2 different attorneys warning about the penalty clauses. But as I looked at my mother's face, twisted with a certainty that had nothing to do with facts, I realized something I'd known on some level for a very long time. Evidence didn't matter. Truth didn't matter. I would never be what she wanted me to be, no matter how many disasters I prevented or how many messes I cleaned up. Apologize to Priya, my mother said, her voice low and dangerous. Right now. Tell her you're sorry for undermining her achievement. The room held its collective breath. I saw Priya watching me with barely concealed satisfaction. I saw Uncle Rajesh staring at his notepad, unable to meet my eyes. I saw Aunt Kavita's face crumple with something that looked like grief. I opened my mouth to respond, and that's when my mother's hand connected with my face. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space. My head snapped to the side, and I felt the sharp sting spread across my left cheek, the coppery taste of blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. For a moment, the world seemed to stop completely. "You are fired, effective immediately," my mother said, her voice shaking with rage. "You will not return to any of our locations until you apologize to your sister for your jealousy, your sabotage, and your complete lack of family loyalty." I straightened slowly, turning my head back to face her. I didn't raise my hand to my burning cheek. I didn't let the tears forming in my eyes fall. I simply looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw a weak woman who'd spent years punishing the daughter who reminded her of her own inadequacies, while elevating the one who made her feel powerful. And then, for just a fraction of a second, I smiled. It was barely there, just the slightest upturn at the corner of my mouth. Gone so quickly, most people would have missed it. But I felt it, and I knew what it meant. This was it. The moment I'd been waiting for. The moment I'd been preparing for since I was 26 years old and first realized my mother would never see me as anything other than a problem to be managed. "Very well," I said. My voice came out perfectly calm, eerily controlled. I collected my tablet, disconnected it from the presentation system, and tucked it under my arm. "I accept your decision." The composure in my voice seemed to unsettle the room, more than if I'd screamed or cried or begged. I watched confusion flicker across my mother's face, quickly followed by something that might have been doubt. She'd expected resistance. She'd expected drama. She'd expected me to fight for a position she'd never really given me in the first place. Instead, I walked toward the door with perfect posture, my heels clicking against the marble floor in a steady, unhurried rhythm. As I reached for the handle, I heard Uncle Rajesh say softly, "Deepa, what have you done?" But I didn't turn around. I simply walked out of that private dining room, down the corridor, lined with photographs of my grandmother's achievements that my mother had gradually replaced with images of herself and Priya, and into the elevator that would take me to my office for the very last time. As the elevator doors closed, I caught my reflection in the polished steel. My left cheek was already starting to redden where her hand had connected. My eyes were dry, and I was still smiling. Just a little, because what none of them knew, not my mother, not Priya, not anyone in that room, was that I'd spent the last 2 years building an exit strategy. Every late night I'd spent fixing Priya's mistakes, documenting them, creating backups, establishing relationships, and quietly constructing a life that didn't need Malhotra Restaurant Group or the Malhotra name. I'd been preparing for this exact moment for 2 years, and now, finally, it was time to let them see what they'd actually lost. If you feel my words, if you've ever been the person holding everything together while someone else took the credit, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Tell me which city you're from, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual, or perhaps time had simply changed texture in the aftermath of violence. My cheek still throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that I knew would blossom into a bruise by evening. I pressed my access card against the reader outside my office and stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a quiet click that sounded remarkably like finality. The space had never truly felt like mine, despite 15 years of occupation. Large windows overlooked the busy Mumbai street below, offering a view my mother had once told me I should be grateful for when she'd assigned me this office at 21. The desk was teak wood and chrome, modern but impersonal, chosen by a designer rather than by me. The walls held framed certificates of culinary achievements and industry awards. All earned, none celebrated. I walked to the storage closet and pulled out 3 cardboard boxes, setting them on the desk with a soft thud. I started with the filing cabinets, working methodically through 15 years of organized documentation. My hands moved automatically, muscle memory from countless late nights spent in this very spot. But my mind was cataloging everything with clinical precision. Each folder I touched carried a memory. A small wound in an anthology of paper cuts that had slowly bled me dry. The Oberoi Hotels folder reminded me of the time Priya had accidentally sent our confidential pricing strategy to their competitor. I discovered the error at 11 p.m. on a Friday, spent the entire weekend on the phone with Oberoi's procurement director, a man who'd worked with my grandmother and still had respect for the Malhotra name, convincing him it was a technical glitch rather than corporate espionage. By Monday morning, I'd not only salvaged the relationship, but had restructured our entire email security protocol to prevent future incidents. That Tuesday, my mother had called me into her office to lecture me about making Priya feel bad by implementing new systems without consulting her first. I placed the folder in the box and reached for the next one. The Heritage Foods contract files brought back the memory of Priya promising a 3-month supply timeline to impress a buyer during a trade show dinner, despite our production capacity requiring at least 7 months. I'd spent 48 hours straight reorganizing our entire supply chain, calling in favors from vendors I'd carefully cultivated relationships with over years, and personally overseeing a production schedule that had our team working in rotating shifts. We delivered in 3 months and 3 weeks. Priya got featured in Hospitality magazine as the visionary behind Malhotra Restaurant Group's aggressive expansion strategy. I got an email from my mother saying I needed to be more of a team player because apparently I'd made some of Priya's original promises look slightly optimistic in front of the client. Box 1 filled up quickly. I moved to Box 2, pulling down the small personal items that had accumulated over the years. A trophy from a culinary competition where I'd represented our restaurants and won first place, which my mother had displayed for exactly 1 week before moving it to storage because Priya felt it was intimidating. A framed photograph of my grandmother in this very office back when it had been hers, back when Malhotra Restaurant Group meant something beyond my mother's ego and Priya's Instagram-ready career. I wrapped the frame carefully in tissue paper, wondering what my grandmother would think of what her company had become. My entire 36 years had been an exercise in conditional love. When I was 8 and won the school cooking competition, my mother had smiled and said, "That's my girl," before immediately asking if I'd helped Priya with her project too. When I graduated top of my class from culinary school at 22, she'd attended the ceremony, but spent the reception talking about Priya's natural business instincts, despite her having dropped out of her hospitality management program after 1 semester. When I'd pulled Malhotra Restaurant Group back from the brink of bankruptcy at 29, after a disastrous menu launch Priya had championed, my mother had thanked me privately and then publicly credited Priya's bold vision for the eventual turnaround. I was loved when I was useful. I was valued when I was invisible. I was family when I was serving their interests. But those days were over. I pulled up my laptop and opened the resignation letter I'd drafted 18 months ago and updated quarterly ever since, like a will for a life I was preparing to leave behind. The document was pristine in its simplicity, devoid of emotion or accusation. It stated my immediate resignation from all positions at Malhotra Restaurant Group, effective upon delivery of the letter. It offered a 2-week transition period if desired by the management. It thanked the company for the opportunity and wished everyone well in their future endeavors. It was professional, courteous, and utterly final. 3 paragraphs, 142 words. The death certificate of my mother's control over my life. I printed it on company letterhead, signed it with the pen my grandmother had given me when I joined the company, and placed it in the center of the now empty desk. The envelope was crisp white, addressed simply to Board of Directors, Malhotra Restaurant Group. I propped it against the base of the desk lamp where it couldn't possibly be missed. The third box held the last of my personal files, encrypted backup drives containing documentation I'd been compiling for 2 years. Every email where Priya had made a critical error. Every late-night fix I'd implemented. Every instance where my mother had rewritten history to make Priya the hero and me the obstacle. 15 years of evidence meticulously organized, time-stamped, and verified. I'd created this archive not out of spite, but out of self-preservation, knowing that someday I might need to prove my own worth to myself, if no one else would acknowledge it. I sealed the boxes with packing tape, the sound sharp and satisfying in the quiet office. I took one last look around the space that had been both my kingdom and my prison. The late afternoon sun streamed through those windows, casting long shadows across the empty desk. I'd given this company 15 years of 80-hour weeks, countless sacrifices, and my complete dedication. In return, I'd received a slap and a firing. It was the best trade I'd ever made. I picked up 2 of the boxes, balancing them carefully, and walked out. I'd come back for the third box tomorrow, but I already knew I'd never step foot in this office as an employee again. The door locked automatically behind me, and I didn't look back. The office that had felt like a cage for 15 years had just become my launching pad. And tomorrow morning, when Priya walked in, expecting to gloat over my humiliation, she would discover exactly what she'd actually won. The next morning, Priya walked into my former office, expecting triumph, and froze in absolute horror. I didn't witness Priya's arrival, but my assistant, technically a former assistant, Anjali, texted me a photo at 8:47. The image showed Priya standing in the doorway of the empty office, her mouth slightly open, one hand frozen mid-reach as if she'd been about to touch something that was no longer there. Her expression was a portrait of confusion, sliding rapidly towards something darker. Anjali's message read simply, "She's been standing there for 5 minutes, not moving, just staring." I was 2 hours north by then, sitting in a cafe in Lonavala with an excellent filter coffee and my laptop, watching the sunrise over the misty hills. I'd driven up the night before, checked into a small bed and breakfast that asked no questions, and slept better than I had in 15 years. The photo of Priya's frozen shock was the perfect accompaniment to my morning coffee. Astron PMPP. According to Anjali, who continued sending updates like a war correspondent from the front lines, Priya had arrived at the office at 8:30 wearing a new designer outfit and carrying herself with the swagger of someone who believed she'd finally won. She'd apparently told the receptionist that she was checking on some transitional matters in Mira's office, her voice dripping with false concern that barely masked her satisfaction. She'd taken the elevator to the executive floor, her heels clicking with confident authority, and pushed open the door to my corner office, expecting to find me broken, compliant, and ready to grovel. Instead, she found a space so thoroughly stripped, it looked like I'd never existed at all. Anjali reported that Priya walked slowly around the empty office, opening drawers that held nothing, running her fingers along the bare shelves where my files had been. The resignation letter sat in the center of the desk, pristine white against the polished wood, impossible to miss. Priya picked it up with shaking hands and read it 3 times. According to Anjali, who'd positioned herself near the doorway under the pretense of delivering mail. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Priya said aloud to the empty room. Anjali swore there was genuine panic in her voice. She was supposed to apologize. She always apologizes eventually. But I hadn't apologized. I'd left. And that simple act had apparently short-circuited Priya's entire understanding of how our family dynamic worked. The panic spread like wildfire through the company within the hour. Anjali's updates came rapid fire. 9:15, Senior Chef Ravi Kumar asking loudly in the hallway, "Who has Mira's supplier contact list?" 9:32, Operations Manager Nisha Patel standing in the empty office muttering. She was the only one who knew how all the vendor contracts interconnected. 9:47, a cluster of longtime employees gathering outside my former office, their faces reflecting the same dawning horror that I'd apparently broken some fundamental law of nature by actually leaving. Without Mira, we're completely lost. I heard one voice say on a video clip Anjali sent me. She was the one who made everything work. Priya just smiled for the cameras. I imagine Priya standing in that empty office, hearing those words drift up from the hallway, finally understanding that she'd never actually held any real power at all. She'd been performing leadership while I'd been executing it. She'd been taking credit while I'd been taking responsibility. And now that I was gone, the carefully maintained illusion of her competence had evaporated like morning mist under harsh sunlight. Anjali's final update of the morning came at 10:15. Your mother just arrived, face like thunder. Priya's crying in the conference room. I could picture my mother storming through the building, her ego bruised by what she'd surely interpret as my tantrum, fully expecting to find me packed and ready to slink back with my tail between my legs. She'd probably rehearsed a magnanimous speech about accepting my apology and giving me another chance that would somehow make her the hero of this story. Instead, she found an empty office and a resignation letter. According to my sources, I had more than just Anjali. 15 years of treating people with basic human decency had earned me loyalties my mother knew nothing about. My mother initially dismissed the whole thing as theater. She'll be back by Monday, she'd apparently told the company lawyer, Vikram Khanna, who'd been called up to the executive floor to review the letter. This is just Mira being dramatic. She needs this job more than we need her. Vikram, to his credit, had actually read the letter carefully. Then he'd pulled up my employment files, my contracts, and the organizational charts that showed my signature authorities and relationship ownerships. I knew the exact moment when Vikram's face went pale because Anjali caught it on her phone and sent me the clip. The lawyer had looked up from his tablet and said very quietly, "Deepa, we have a significant problem." My mother had waved him off. "She's fired, not quit. She'll calm down and come back." "No," Vikram said, his voice taking on that particular tone lawyers use when delivering very bad news. "You don't understand. Mira has signatory authority on 32 active supplier contracts. She's the primary relationship manager for our 4 largest vendors who specifically requested her involvement. She controls access to proprietary recipes that she personally developed. And many of these arrangements," Vikram paused, scrolling through something on his screen, "many of these were structured so that her authority is personal, not positional. She can transfer them, but we can't." I'd spent 2 years building those protections, careful and quiet and meticulous. Every contract renewal, every vendor meeting, every recipe development had been structured to ensure that I, Mira Sharma the person, not Mira Sharma the operations manager, held the keys. It was perfectly legal, carefully documented, and completely devastating to anyone who thought I was replaceable. My mother apparently sat down heavily in one of the conference room chairs. "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means," Vikram said, "that you didn't just fire your operations manager. You likely just triggered a cascade of contractual complications that could—" That's when Vikram's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and Anjali reported that his face somehow went even paler. He answered, listened for approximately 30 seconds, and then said something that made my mother stand up so fast her chair fell backward. "The Freshmart partnership has been canceled. They'll only work with Mira." I was refilling my coffee when Anjali's text arrived with a screenshot of an email from Freshmart Corporate. The subject line read, "Partnership termination effective immediately." I sat back down at my corner table in the Lonavala Cafe, the morning sun warming my shoulders, and read the attachment with the same clinical detachment I'd once used to review Priya's disasters. The email was professional, cold, and utterly devastating. Freshmart was withdrawing from all agreements with Malhotra Restaurant Group, citing lack of confidence in current management's ability to deliver on contractual obligations. The termination was effective immediately, with penalty clauses waived as a professional courtesy to the years of excellent service provided by Ms. Meera Sharma personally. I noticed they'd copied the email to my mother, Priya, Vikram Khanna, and the entire board of directors. They wanted everyone to know exactly why they were leaving. Anjali followed up with a voice memo recorded from outside the conference room, where my mother had apparently retreated with Vikram and Priya. I could hear my mother's voice, tight with barely controlled panic, demanding to know how this had happened. Then a different voice came on the line. The call had been transferred to speaker, and I recognized Amit Desai, Freshmart's chief procurement officer, a man I'd worked with personally on 4 separate projects over the past 3 years. "Mrs. Malhotra," Amit said, his business precision evident even through Anjali's recording, "I want to be clear about why we're taking this action. We received credible information yesterday afternoon that Ms. Priya Malhotra has a documented history of unreliable decision-making that has compromised multiple projects." The source provided specific examples, dates, and outcomes. "We did our own verification overnight and found the information to be accurate." Emmett continued, "I heard Priya's voice in the background, high and defensive. That's a lie. Someone is sabotaging me." Emmett continued, "The information came from internal Malhotra Restaurant Group documentation." Amit continued, ignoring the outburst. "More importantly, our analysis revealed that every successful project we've considered with your company had one common denominator: Meera Sharma's direct involvement. She was the reason we maintained confidence in your capabilities, despite management inconsistencies." My mother's voice cut in, trying to sound authoritative, but coming across as desperate. "Mr. Desai, I assure you that Priya's errors have been addressed, and we have full capability to—" "With respect, Mrs. Malhotra, they weren't errors. Our review showed a 3-year pattern of overpromising and requiring extensive correction. The only reason those corrections succeeded was because of Meera Sharma's intervention." Amit paused, and I could almost see him checking his notes. "Unless Miss Meera Sharma provides personal written guarantee of project oversight, we cannot in good conscience move forward with any partnership. That is our final position." The line went dead. Anjali's recording captured what sounded like something heavy being thrown against a wall, followed by Priya sobbing, and my mother saying words I couldn't quite make out, but whose tone suggested she was starting to comprehend the magnitude of what she'd done. By noon, according to my network of informants still inside Malhotra Restaurant Group, Vikram had compiled what he grimly called the damage assessment. He'd presented it to an emergency board meeting that included my mother, Priya, Uncle Rajesh, and 3 other senior directors. The document Anjali managed to photograph and send me was 42 pages of meticulously organized evidence that I'd never actually hidden. Vikram had pulled it from existing company files, email archives, and project records that I'd never bothered to conceal, because I'd never imagined anyone would actually look. The timeline was devastating in its clarity. 10 major projects over 3 years. In each case, Priya had made critical errors. The Taj Hotels contract, where she'd promised delivery in 4 months for a menu system requiring 12. The ITC bid, where she'd accidentally specified ingredients that violated their sustainability requirements. The partnership with Zomato, where she'd agreed to commission rates that would have bankrupted us if we'd missed a single target. And in every single case, there was a corresponding record of Meera Sharma working 72-hour stretches, calling in favors, restructuring timelines, and somehow pulling success from the jaws of disaster. The email records were even more damning. Priya's name appeared on press releases, client announcements, and industry awards. My name appeared on internal crisis management threads, late-night technical consultations, and vendor emergency negotiations. She'd gotten the credit, I'd done the work, and everyone had been happy to maintain that fiction as long as it kept the machine running. Uncle Rajesh apparently stood up during the meeting and said something that Anjali heard through the conference room door. Priya isn't incompetent because she's stupid. She's incompetent because someone has been setting her up to fail, and we were all too comfortable to notice. That's when Vikram dropped the detail that made my coffee suddenly taste bitter. He'd cross-referenced the dates of Priya's worst decisions with her calendar, and found a pattern that Anjali said made my mother go very, very quiet. Before each major mistake, Priya had a meeting or phone call with someone listed only as SK Business Mentor. The initials appeared 14 times over 3 years, and each appearance preceded a decision that required my intervention to fix. "Who is SK?" Uncle Rajesh asked, according to Anjali's account. Priya, still crying, had whispered, "Samir Kapoor. He's a family friend who's been advising me on strategy. He said he wanted to help me prove myself." The room apparently went silent. Vikram pulled up information on Samir Kapoor, and Anjali reported that my mother's face had turned an alarming shade of gray when she saw the name. Samir Kapoor ran Kapoor Consulting, a corporate advisory firm known for hostile acquisitions. More than that, and this is what made my mother stand up and walk to the window, Samir Kapoor had been my grandmother's first business partner, a man she'd bought out 28 years ago and spent the rest of her life trying to forget. Someone had been deliberately sabotaging Malhotra Restaurant Group from the inside, using Priya's ambition and naivety as the weapon. And the only person who'd been catching and neutralizing those attacks was now sitting 2 states away, drinking excellent coffee and watching the entire structure collapse in real time. Anjali's final message of the afternoon was brief. "Your mother asked me to contact you. She wants to know what it will take for you to come back. I told her I don't have your new number. What should I say?" I didn't respond because the Freshmart loss was just the beginning, and I had no intention of stopping the bleeding. Not yet. But the partnership cancellation was just the beginning, because what my mother didn't know was that Mira had left behind documentation that would tear the company apart from within. I'd arranged for the courier service 3 weeks earlier, back when I was still refining the final sections of what I'd privately called the reckoning. The dossier had been completed for 18 months, updated quarterly like a living document, waiting for the inevitable moment when my mother's favoritism would cross from merely painful into professionally untenable. The slap had simply provided the perfect timing. The packages went out at 6 p.m. on Thursday evening, delivered to home addresses I'd carefully verified through public records and discreet inquiries, not to the office where my mother could intercept them, not to corporate emails she could block, but to the personal residences of all 9 board members, timed to arrive during their Friday morning routines when they'd be most receptive to reading something substantial. Each envelope contained an identical 214-page document, professionally bound, with a simple cover page that read, "Malhotra Restaurant Group, Forensic Analysis of Management Efficacy 2018 to 2024, compiled by Mira Sharma." I'd labored over that dossier with the same meticulous attention I'd given to every project I'd ever saved. The opening section contained a comprehensive timeline of 10 major projects, displayed in a side-by-side format that would make even the most casual reader understand the discrepancy. On the left, Priya's public claims, her press interviews, her social media posts celebrating her visionary leadership. On the right, the actual project records, showing missed deadlines, impossible promises, and contractual violations that should have sunk each initiative. And in the center column, highlighted in pale blue, my work, time-stamped and verified, showing the midnight interventions and weekend marathons that had transformed certain disasters into celebrated successes. The Taj Hotels section alone ran 15 pages. I'd included the original contract Priya had negotiated, promising a 4-month delivery timeline, her enthusiastic email to the client calling it ambitious but achievable, and the kitchen assessment I'd commissioned that proved the actual requirement was 12 months minimum. Then came my restructuring plan, the vendor negotiations I'd personally conducted at 2 a.m. because our suppliers were based in different time zones, and the final delivery report showing we'd somehow met an adjusted 8-month timeline that I'd negotiated directly with Taj's project manager during a series of calls Priya never knew about. The conclusion was the industry magazine article praising Priya's bold vision and flawless execution. I'd included financial impact analyses for each project, calculated by an independent consultant I'd hired using my own money. The numbers were staggering. Priya's initial decisions on these 10 projects would have cost Malhotra Restaurant Group approximately 8 crore rupees in penalties, lost contracts, and damaged relationships. My corrections had not only prevented those losses, but had generated an additional 3 crore in revenue through the relationship capital I built with clients who appreciated competence over charisma. The section I knew would hurt most was titled Crisis Management Logs and Subsequent Leadership Response. Here I documented 47 instances over 15 years where I'd worked extreme hours to fix Priya's mistakes, accompanied by the emails or meeting notes from the following morning where my mother had somehow found fault with my approach. There was the time I'd spent 72 hours straight reworking a menu proposal after Priya had accidentally sent our recipe secrets to a competitor, only to have my mother scold me in the next management meeting for making Priya feel micromanaged by implementing a new proposal review system. Strong P. There was the weekend I'd personally driven to 3 different supplier facilities to salvage relationships after Priya had insulted their representatives at a trade conference dinner, followed by my mother's lecture about my lack of team spirit for not attending that dinner in the first place. Strong P. Strong. Each entry was backed by email screenshots, calendar invitations, security logs showing my building access at odd hours, and in some cases, testimonials from employees who'd worked those emergency shifts with me. No accusations, no emotional language, just timestamps and facts arranged in a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Strong. The external influence timeline occupied pages 163 through 188 and represented some of my finest investigative work. I'd cross-referenced Priya's calendar entries with project outcomes, identified the pattern of contact with SK Business Mentor, and mapped how each consultation preceded a decision that benefited neither Priya nor Malhotra Restaurant Group. I stopped short of accusing Samir Kapoor directly. I didn't have proof of his intentions yet, only the correlation, but I included enough data that any competent board member would recognize corporate sabotage when they saw it. I'd even included a brief biography of Samir, mentioning casually that he was formerly business partner of Savitri Malhotra, company founder, partnership dissolved 1996. The metadata analysis came last, a technical appendix that proved these documents weren't compiled in angry retaliation after the slap. File creation dates stretched back 15 years. Modification timestamps showed quarterly updates. Backup logs demonstrated systematic preservation of evidence over time. I'd built this archive the same way I'd built everything else at Malhotra Restaurant Group, carefully, methodically, and with an eye toward the future most people refuse to see coming. My final note, printed on page 214, read, "This documentation exists not for revenge, but to ensure Malhotra Restaurant Group understands the actual risks it faces. The company I've protected for 15 years is now vulnerable to threats both external and internal. I hope the board will choose to address these vulnerabilities wisely, with or without my involvement. The decision, as always, is yours to make." By Saturday morning, my phone had 14 missed calls from board members whose numbers I recognized and 3 from numbers I didn't. Uncle Rajesh had left a voicemail that Anjali later told me had made her cry. "Mira, I worked with your grandmother for 20 years, and I failed her granddaughter for 15. I have no right to ask this, but please call me back. We need to fix this. We need to fix what we've done to you." Aunt Kavita, the CFO who'd never once defended me in a board meeting, sent an email with the subject line, "I'm sorry," and a body that simply said, "I was a coward. You deserved better. The company deserves better. Tell us what you need." Even Mr. Sharma, the 65-year-old director who had served with my grandfather and whom I'd always considered my mother's closest ally, left a message that Anjali said she'd never forget. I read every page twice. "We've been complicit in abusing this woman for 15 years, and I'm ashamed. If Meera Sharma never speaks to us again, we'll have earned that silence." But I didn't call them back. Not yet. Because while Malhotra Restaurant Group descended into panic and soul-searching, I was 2 states away in Lonavala, sipping excellent coffee and living a life they'd never known I'd built. The bed and breakfast in Lonavala had excellent Wi-Fi, which was all I really needed. I'd set up my temporary office in the sunroom overlooking the valley, where morning mist rolled through the hills and peacocks performed their endless territorial displays. My laptop displayed the quarterly report I'd been waiting for. Shakti Women's Culinary Fund had closed the second quarter with 7.2 crore rupees in assets under management, up 19% from the previous quarter. 38 women, most of them over 45, most of them told by investors that they were too old or too female or too niche, had built successful food businesses with the seed funding I'd provided over the past 10 years. I'd started the fund with 30 lakh rupees earned from licensing my first signature recipe, a fusion masala blend I'd developed during my second year at Malhotra Restaurant Group, working in my apartment kitchen on weekends because the company's facilities were too busy for the kind of experimentation I needed. The recipe was mine, not the company's, because I'd been meticulous about using my own resources and my own time. My mother had never known about it because she'd never asked what I did with my evenings. She'd assumed I went home and ate takeout alone, probably crying about Priya's latest triumph. Instead, I'd been building an empire she couldn't touch. The fund's portfolio read like a catalog of second chances. Lakshmi Iyer, age 52, had pitched me to an organic spice company after being laid off from a corporate food manufacturer that told her she didn't fit their young culture anymore. Her company now held 8 certifications and had just secured a contract with a major retail chain. Fatima Khan, 49, had developed a home delivery service for authentic regional cuisines after watching her hometown's culinary traditions disappear as young people moved to cities. She'd been rejected by 15 traditional investors before I'd given her 25 lakh in seed funding. Her company now operated in 12 cities and generated 1.8 crore in annual revenue. These women didn't just represent good investments, though the returns had been solid. They represented a network of genuine power built on mutual respect and shared experience rather than family obligation or corporate hierarchy. When I'd sent a brief message to the fund's advisory board explaining that I'd left Malhotra Restaurant Group and might be less available for the next few weeks, I'd received 19 responses within an hour. Lakshmi wrote, "You gave me a second chance at 52 when everyone else saw me as obsolete. Whatever you need, I'm here." Fatima offered to connect me with her attorney if I needed legal support. 3 other founders offered guest rooms if I needed places to stay. This was family, the chosen kind that actually mattered. The fund was just one part of what I'd built in the shadows of my family's contempt. My investment portfolio included carefully selected real estate acquired during market downturns. A commercial property in Pune leased to a bakery collective, a residential duplex in Bangalore that generated rental income, and a vacation cottage in Coorg that I'd bought foreclosed and renovated myself over 2 years of long weekends. I'd served as a silent partner in 4 food startups, providing not just capital, but culinary consulting that the founders actually valued. My 3 registered recipes, all related to fusion cuisine techniques that had applications far beyond Malhotra Restaurant Group's traditional offerings, generated modest but steady licensing revenue. When I tallied everything, the fund, the real estate, the startup equity, the recipe royalties, my investment accounts, my personal net worth sat at approximately 6.4 crore rupees. Not Ambani money, not even enough to make the business magazine lists, but more than sufficient to live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever setting foot in a Malhotra restaurant again. I achieved this through a discipline that my family had mistaken for joylessness. Living in a modest two-bedroom flat in a neighborhood Priya would have called depressing, while she'd leveraged the company expense account for a penthouse in Bandra. Investing 40% of my salary, while my mother assumed I was too incompetent to manage money and probably spent it all on cooking classes and recipe books. Building relationships with people who valued my skills and integrity rather than my last name or my ability to make Priya look good. The irony was almost funny. My family's greatest strategic error had been assuming I needed them. They'd structured their entire emotional leverage around the belief that without Malhotra Restaurant Group, without the family name, without my mother's grudging approval, I'd be nothing. They'd never bothered to notice that I'd been systematically building a life that didn't require any of them. A safety net woven from competence and careful planning, rather than inheritance and nepotism. My phone continued buzzing with messages from Malhotra Restaurant Group. Uncle Rajesh had called 8 times. Aunt Kavita had sent increasingly desperate emails. Even Priya had left a voicemail, though I deleted it without listening because I wasn't ready to hear whatever combination of tears and accusations she'd prepared. Each notification was a small validation, proof that I'd been right about who actually needed whom in this relationship. The messages from my real network told a different story. Lakshmi sent a photo of her team celebrating their retail contract with a note. Because of you, 14 people have jobs they love and thousands of families get organic spices. That's a legacy. Fatima shared news that another city had just launched her service, bringing her total reach to over 500,000 customers. A founder I'd backed 3 years ago announced she'd just been acquired by a major hospitality group, which would generate a 280% return on my initial investment. And, more importantly, meant her recipes would reach a much wider audience. This was what success actually looked like when it wasn't measured by my mother's approval or Priya's reflected glory. This was the life I'd built. While they'd been too busy performing family dysfunction to notice I'd been planning my exit for years. The sun was setting over the Lonavala Valley, painting the mist in shades of gold and purple, when my phone lit up with a text from Anjali. Your mother just left the office. She asked me for your location. I told her I don't know. But Mira, she looked broken. Really broken. Be careful. I was drafting a response when headlights swept across the sunroom windows. A car pulled into the bed and breakfast small driveway, and through the growing darkness, I watched my mother step out, moving like a woman who'd aged 20 years in 3 days. I watched through the window as my mother sat in her car for nearly 5 minutes before finally opening the door. Even from a distance, I could see the unfamiliar slope of her shoulders, the way she moved like someone who'd forgotten how her own body worked. Deepa Malhotra had always carried herself with the rigid posture of a woman who believed authority was something you wore like expensive jewelry. The person climbing my porch steps looked diminished, almost fragile. When she knocked, I waited a full 30 seconds before answering. Let her stand there. Let her wonder if I was even going to open the door. When I finally did, her appearance shocked me more than I wanted to admit. Her silver hair, usually immaculate, had strands escaping from her bun like she'd been running her hands through it compulsively. Her silk kurta was wrinkled, no jewelry, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. This was the first time my mother had visited any home of mine since I was 18 and still living under her roof. Mira. Her voice came out rough. She cleared her throat and tried again. We need to talk about your responsibilities to the family. The word responsibilities cracked in the middle, betraying the authority she was trying to project. I stepped aside to let her in, not out of warmth, but because I wanted this conversation to happen on my terms, in my space. She walked into the sunroom and looked around with barely concealed confusion, as if she couldn't reconcile this comfortable, carefully chosen environment with her image of me living some sad, diminished existence, without the Malhotra name propping me up. 3 more major clients have suspended their contracts, she said, still standing because I hadn't invited her to sit. The Oberoi Group, ITC Hotels, and Taj. They all said the same thing. They don't have confidence in current management. The board is calling emergency meetings every 6 hours. Rajesh is threatening to resign if we don't address the leadership crisis immediately. And Priya. She paused, something painful crossing her face. Priya has locked herself in her apartment and won't answer anyone's calls. Vikram thinks she might be having some kind of breakdown. She turned to face me fully, and I saw her struggling to find the script she'd rehearsed. The speech where she'd somehow make my return sound like noble duty rather than desperate need. The legacy that your grandmother and I built is collapsing. You have a responsibility to— No, I said it quietly, but the words stopped her mid-sentence. I fulfilled my responsibilities for 15 years while you told me I was never good enough. I'm not returning to be Priya's safety net or your scapegoat. Mira, please, I know things have been difficult, but your grandmother would be disappointed in you for abandoning the family like this. The emotional manipulation was so predictable, it was almost boring. I walked to my bag and pulled out the journal I'd been carrying with me since the slap, the one I'd found in my grandmother's belongings 7 years ago and had been reading and rereading ever since. My mother's eyes widened when she recognized it. Would she? I opened a page I'd marked with a yellow tab. March 22nd, 2017. Deepa is getting weaker. She can't make a decision without checking with that consultant friend of hers first. I'm worried she's going to sacrifice Mira to protect her own ego. She's so much stronger than Deepa is, and Deepa resents her for it. I flipped to another marked page. July 8th, 2019. Watch Deepa scold Mira today for fixing another of Priya's mistakes. She's so afraid of her own inadequacy that she punishes competence and rewards incompetence. I don't know how to protect her from her mother anymore. My mother had gone very pale. Where did you get that? Grandmother left it for me. I've had it for 7 years. I closed the journal and held it against my chest like a shield. I've known exactly what you are for a long time, Ma, and I still tried to help. I still stayed. I still worked 80-hour weeks to keep your company alive while you blamed me for every problem Priya created. The fact that you think grandmother would be disappointed in me for finally leaving is proof you never understood her at all. She sat down heavily in one of the chairs without asking permission, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But Deepa Malhotra had spent too many years building walls around her emotions to let them break that easily. Instead, she stared at her hands and said something I didn't expect. There's someone— She stopped, started again. A business consultant I've been taking advice from for years. Samir Kapoor. He presented himself as an old family friend, someone who knew your grandmother back in the early days. He's always known exactly what to say about Priya, about you, about the company. My mother looked up at me, and I saw genuine confusion in her eyes. But lately, I'm wondering if you wanted this to happen, if you wanted us to fall apart. The name hit me like ice water. Samir Kapoor. I'd seen that name in my grandmother's journal, always written with a particular intensity that suggested pain barely contained. Her first business partner, the man she'd bought out and spent the rest of her life trying to forget, and he'd been advising my mother for years. What kind of advice did he give you? I kept my voice level, but my heart was racing. He'd call every few months, always with insights about the business. He encouraged me to give Priya more authority, said she had natural leadership instincts that just needed room to grow. He suggested that you were too controlling, too risk-averse, that you were holding Priya back from her potential. My mother rubbed her face. Every time I had doubts about a decision, he'd somehow call right when I needed guidance. It felt like providence. Now it feels like manipulation. It was manipulation, I finished. Systematic, deliberate manipulation. My mother looked at me with something approaching horror. You think he's been sabotaging us? Why would he? Because grandmother bought him out. The words came out harder than I intended. She left him, built a life without him, created something successful. And he's the kind of man who never forgives. That. My mother started to stand abruptly, agitation replacing her earlier exhaustion. Wait, my mother had said father, but she'd caught herself. The slip was telling. If that's true, if he's been deliberately destroying the company, then we need to fight back. We need you back, Mira. We need to. We? I let the question hang in the air. There is no we, Ma. You slapped me in front of the staff and fired me for telling the truth. You spent 15 years choosing Priya over me, blame over fairness, ego over reality. The fact that you might have been manipulated doesn't erase what you did. It just makes you a victim too, and I'm done saving victims who won't save themselves. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, I watched my mother truly lost for words. She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the knob, and said without turning around, I'm sorry. I know it's too late, and I know it's not enough, but I'm sorry. After she left, I stood at the window, watching her taillights disappear down the mountain road. And night had settled in completely, turning the valley into a black canvas dotted with the lights of distant villages. I was about to close the curtains when I noticed something that made my breath catch. A black sedan parked down the road, engine off, headlights dark. The same make and model I'd seen outside Malhotra Restaurant Group's headquarters 3 times in the 2 weeks before the slap. The same car I'd dismissed as coincidence because I'd been too focused on surviving each day to see the larger pattern forming around me. Someone was watching. Someone had been watching for a while, and now I knew exactly who it was. If you feel my words, if you understand what it means to finally choose yourself over the people who never chose you, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Tell me which city you're from so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who will never appreciate you and build something so beautiful they'll spend years regretting what they lost. I waited until the sedan had been stationary for 15 minutes before stepping outside with my phone, pretending to take photos of the valley under moonlight while actually zooming in on the license plate. The angle was awkward, but I managed 3 clear shots before retreating back inside. My hands were shaking slightly as I texted the images to Karan Mehta, a private investigator I'd used twice before for background checks on potential fund investments. His specialty was corporate intelligence, and he owed me a favor after I'd funded his wife's catering startup. Karan responded within minutes. On it. Should have preliminary info in an hour. While I waited, I opened my laptop and began pulling threads I should have noticed years ago. Priya's emails mentioning her mentor went back 34 months, always vague about his identity, but specific about his advice. SK says I should push for faster timelines to show confidence. SK thinks you're being too cautious with the Oberoi bid. SK suggested I take the lead on the partnership to prove my capabilities. Every piece of advice I now realized had been precisely calibrated to create disaster. I cross-referenced my mother's calendar against major strategic shifts at Malhotra Restaurant Group. In May 2021, she'd suddenly decided to restructure our kitchen operations against the recommendations of our entire culinary team. A restructuring had cost us 3 head chefs and delayed 2 critical menu launches. Her calendar showed a call with S. Kapoor Business Consulting 2 days before announcing the change. Third strong. In October 2022, she abruptly pulled funding from a promising cloud kitchen concept I've been developing, calling it too risky despite positive third-party assessments. Another call with Samir 3 days prior. The pattern was suffocating in its consistency. Samir would call, my mother would make a destabilizing decision, I would scramble to minimize the damage, and Priya would somehow end up looking like the forward-thinking one, while I was painted as resistant to change. I pulled my grandmother's journals from my bag and started reading them systematically, something I'd never done before, because the pain had always felt too raw. But tonight, I needed answers more than I needed to protect myself from old wounds. The first mention of Samir appeared in an entry from 1992, 2 years before my birth. Samir Kapoor is brilliant, manipulative, and dangerous. Going into business with him was the worst mistake of my life. He doesn't see people as individuals. He sees us as variables in equations he's constantly solving. When I told him I wanted to buy him out, he said, "You'll regret leaving me. I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life regretting it." I believe him. Entry after entry documented a woman trying to escape a man who viewed her departure as a theft of property. Samir called the restaurant again today. Didn't threaten, didn't yell, just asked how I was doing in that voice that suggests he knows everything about my life. I'm going to have to get a restraining order. Another, from 1996, found out Samir has been calling my clients, asking friendly questions about whether I'm stable enough to handle their accounts. He's trying to destroy my reputation because he can't control me anymore. The entries stopped for several years after she'd fully established Malhotra Restaurant Group, and I'd initially assumed that meant Samir had finally moved on. But reading more carefully, I saw references scattered throughout, always oblique, always tinged with fear. Saw Samir at a trade conference today. He smiled at me like we were old friends and asked about the family. I felt sick for hours afterward. Deepa mentioned a helpful consultant who gave her advice about the company. When I asked who, she said just a guy named Samir. My blood ran cold. My phone buzzed. Karan had sent a preliminary report that made my stomach drop. The sedan was registered to a shell company called Meridian Holdings Private Limited, which was owned by another shell company, which ultimately traced back to Kapoor Consulting. Corporate registration documents showed Samir Kapoor as founder and CEO. Kapoor Consulting specialized in corporate advisory and strategic acquisitions, which Karan's notes explained was code for "we break companies from the inside and buy the pieces cheap." I kept reading. Kapoor Consulting had been involved in 11 corporate takeovers in the past 18 years, all following the same pattern. Position someone inside the target company as a helpful advisor. Provide guidance that slowly destabilized operations. Wait for the value to crater. Then acquire the company at a fraction of its actual worth. The average timeline from first contact to acquisition was 4 to 6 years. Samir had been advising my mother for at least 5 years by her own admission. But the detail that made my hands go numb was buried in the corporate filings Karan had accessed. Kapoor Consulting had filed preliminary monitoring reports on Malhotra Restaurant Group with regulatory authorities dating back 28 years. Right around the time my grandmother had bought Samir out. Not acquisition attempts, just monitoring reports, the kind filed when a company or individual is tracking another entity for potential future action. Samir had been watching my grandmother's business for nearly 3 decades. Waiting. And 7 years ago, my grandmother had died in what was ruled an accidental kitchen fire at her home. Single-source ignition on a gas stove she'd used for 40 years. Fire marshal concluded she'd left the burner on accidentally. No witnesses, no reason to suspect foul play. But sitting in my rented sunroom in Lonavala, reading about a man who'd spent 3 decades stalking my grandmother's every move. The word accidental felt increasingly fragile. I flipped to the final entries in her journal, dated just weeks before her death. Samir's calls are becoming more frequent. He's asking about the girls now, using their names like he knows them. He asked how Mira's career is developing and whether Priya is living up to her potential. He shouldn't know these things. I need to document everything in case something happens to me. 2 days before she died, my grandmother had written her last entry. The handwriting was shakier than usual, pressed hard into the paper, like she'd been gripping the pen too tightly. Samir called again. He knows about the girls, their schedules, their roles at the company, even things I haven't told anyone outside the family. He said, "Your granddaughters are impressive, Savitri. It would be tragic if anything disrupted their promising futures." It wasn't a compliment. It was a threat. I have to protect them, but I'm running out of time. Tomorrow I'm going to the police with everything I have. If something happens to me, I need Mira to know. Samir Kapoor will not stop until he's destroyed everything I built and everyone I love. He has to be stopped. The next entry was blank. The following page was blank. The rest of the journal contained only empty lines, a life cut short before the warning could be completed. My grandmother had died on her way home from visiting a lawyer about filing a police complaint. At least that's what the fire investigation suggested based on documents she'd left on her desk. And now her warning sat in my hands, 7 years too late, but suddenly horrifyingly relevant. Samir hadn't just been sabotaging Malhotra Restaurant Group. He'd been positioning pieces on a chessboard for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My grandmother's death had removed his primary obstacle, and now he'd successfully turned my mother against me, weaponized Priya's insecurities, and isolated me from the only company I'd ever known. The black sedan was still parked down the road, still watching, still waiting. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, watching the black sedan through a crack in the curtains. It didn't move. Whoever was inside didn't even pretend to leave. Around 3 a.m., I finally accepted that sleep wasn't coming and retrieved a metal box from my luggage, something I'd been carrying with me but hadn't opened in months. Inside was a USB drive my grandmother had given me on my 25th birthday, with instructions that had seemed cryptic at the time. Don't open this until you're ready to understand the whole truth. Too focused on surviving each day at Malhotra Restaurant Group to properly examine what she'd left me. Now, with Samir's surveillance outside my window and the weight of her warnings pressing down on me, I was finally ready. I plugged the drive into my laptop. It contained a single folder labeled "For Mira, the Complete Story." Inside were video files, audio recordings, scanned documents, and a text file that began, "My dearest Mira, if you're reading this, it means I didn't survive long enough to stop him myself. But you can. Everything you need is here." The first video showed my grandmother sitting in her home office, looking tired but determined. "Mira, Samir Kapoor is not just a bad business partner I bought out. He's a predator who destroys people for sport, and he's been circling our family for decades." She explained how their partnership had started promisingly, but had quickly revealed Samir's true nature. He didn't want to build a successful business. He wanted to control people, to prove his superiority by manipulating them into destroying themselves. "When I bought him out, I thought I was free," my grandmother said, her voice heavy. "But Samir doesn't accept defeat. He sees it as a temporary setback in a longer game. I've spent 28 years watching him circle, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back." The next files were even more disturbing. Audio recordings of phone calls where Samir had contacted my grandmother's suppliers, subtly suggesting she was becoming unstable. Emails he'd sent to potential investors, planting seeds of doubt about her business acumen. Security footage from outside our restaurants, showing Samir's car parked across the street, watching, documenting, waiting. "He's been teaching himself how we operate," my grandmother explained in another video. learning our vulnerabilities, identifying who might be susceptible to his manipulation. He approached Deepa 3 years ago, positioned himself as a helpful mentor, and she was too flattered to see the trap. I watched my grandmother's face on the screen, seeing the fear she'd hidden from all of us. I tried to warn Deepa, but he'd already poisoned her against listening to me. He told her I was jealous of her success, that I was trying to maintain control because I couldn't accept her as an equal leader, and she believed him. The final video was dated 1 week before her death. My grandmother looked exhausted, almost defeated, but her voice remained steady. "I'm going to the police tomorrow with everything I have. It's finally enough to get a restraining order, maybe even press charges for harassment and corporate espionage. But Mira, if something happens to me, you need to know he won't stop. He'll shift his focus to you and Priya, turn you against each other, use your mother's weakness against the whole family. The only way to stop him is to expose him publicly, completely, so thoroughly that he can't manipulate his way out of it." She leaned closer to the camera. "You're stronger than I ever was, smarter than he expects, and you understand systems in a way that terrifies him. End what he began, sweetheart. Protect your sister. Save the company if you can. But most importantly, stop him from hurting anyone else. I believe in you more than I've ever believed in anything." The video ended with my grandmother reaching toward the camera, and then the screen went black. I sat in the dim sunroom, tears streaming down my face, holding evidence that my grandmother had died trying to protect me from a threat I'd been too naive to see coming. My phone buzzed in the silence, making me jump. A text from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Your grandmother couldn't stop me. What makes you think you can?" I stared at the threatening text for a full minute before the second message arrived. This one was an image, a high-resolution photograph of me, walking out of Malhotra Restaurant Group's headquarters on the day I'd resigned, carrying boxes, my face visible in perfect detail. The timestamp showed it had been taken from across the street, probably with a professional camera. Someone had been watching me that closely, documenting my departure like evidence in a file they were building. The third message arrived before I could process the second. An email from an encrypted address with no subject line, just an attachment labeled Malhotra Kapoor Partnership Agreement 1990 PDF. My finger hovered over the attachment for several seconds, some instinct warning me that opening it would cross a threshold I couldn't return from. But I'd already crossed so many thresholds in the past week that one more seemed inevitable. The document was a business partnership agreement dated 1990, professionally formatted and bearing the signatures of both my grandmother, Savitri Malhotra, and Samir Kapoor. Standard partnership terms, 50-50 ownership, shared decision-making authority. But there was an amendment dated 1993, and reading it made my blood run cold. A clause stating that in the event of partnership dissolution, the departing partner retained rights to review and approve all major business decisions for a period of 25 years to protect their initial investment and legacy. My grandmother had signed it. The amendment was notarized, legal, and apparently still in effect for another year. Samir legally had the right to be consulted on major decisions at Malhotra Restaurant Group. My grandmother had been trapped in a contract that kept him in her life for decades after she'd thought she was free. A follow-up email arrived seconds later, this one containing a single line. "Your grandmother signed away more than she realized. Some debts take generations to repay. I'm just collecting what I'm owed." I immediately forwarded everything to Karan, asking him to verify the authenticity of the partnership agreement and trace the email's origin. While I waited, my mind was racing through implications that made me feel sick. Every piece of advice Samir had given my mother, every manipulation of Priya, every step of the sabotage, he'd been operating under the legal cover of that contract amendment. He could claim he was fulfilling his contractual obligation to review major decisions, that his advice was well-intentioned even if it turned out poorly. And if anyone tried to cut him out or accused him of sabotage, he could sue Malhotra Restaurant Group for breach of contract, tie us up in litigation for years, and bleed the company dry through legal fees alone. My grandmother had realized this too late. That's why she'd been going to the police with evidence of harassment, rather than trying to nullify the contract through the courts. She'd known that fighting him through legal channels would take too long and cost too much. Karin responded within 30 minutes. The partnership agreement appeared authentic, based on the notary seals and registration numbers. The email had originated from Kapoor Consulting's corporate network, routed through multiple layers, but ultimately traceable to Sameer's personal system. "He's not even trying to hide," Karin wrote. "This is psychological warfare. He wants you to know he's watching, wants you to feel hunted. Be very careful, Meera." I pulled up my grandmother's files again, searching for any reference to how she'd planned to fight back against the contract. Most of her notes focused on documenting Sameer's harassment, building a criminal case rather than a civil one. But buried in a subfolder labeled Nuclear Option, I found a document that made me sit up straighter. A legal brief prepared by a corporate attorney outlining how partnership agreements could be voided if one party could prove the other had acted in bad faith, deliberately sabotaging the business they were contractually obligated to protect. The burden of proof was high. You needed to demonstrate a pattern of malicious intent, show that the advice given was designed to harm rather than help, proof that the damage was deliberate rather than merely incompetent. But I had that proof. My dossier of Priya's failures and my corrections, cross-referenced with Sameer's contact dates, created exactly the pattern the attorney had described. The evidence my grandmother had compiled of his harassment and surveillance established malicious intent. The audio recordings and emails showed deliberate sabotage. Everything my grandmother had gathered, combined with everything I documented over the past 2 years, might be enough to break the contract and remove Sameer's legal protection. But going to court would take months, maybe years. During that time, Sameer could complete his acquisition, destroy what remained of Malhotra Restaurant Group, and disappear into corporate structures too complex to untangle. I needed something faster, something public, something that would expose him so completely that no amount of legal maneuvering could save him. I was still formulating a plan when my phone rang. Priya's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I considered not answering. What could I possibly say to her? How do you tell someone that their mentor has been using them as a weapon? But the phone kept ringing, and some part of me, the part that had spent 15 years protecting Priya from consequences she never saw coming, couldn't let it go to voicemail. I answered on the 5th ring. "Meera." Priya's voice was barely recognizable through her sobbing. Sameer told me everything about grandmother, about the contract, about him using me to destroy us. "Oh God, Meera, is it true? Please tell me it's not true." My heart shattered. "Priya, where are you right now?" "I'm at his office, at Kapoor Consulting. He invited me here to discuss our family situation, and then he showed me the partnership agreement and told me he's been waiting 28 years to destroy what grandmother built. He said I've been helping him do it, and he seemed so proud." Sagging finally, she dissolved into incoherent crying. "Meera, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I thought he believed in me, but he was just using me, and I was too stupid and desperate to see it. Priya, listen to me very carefully." I kept my voice as calm as I could manage while my pulse hammered in my ears. "You need to leave that office right now. Don't explain, don't argue. Just tell them you need air and walk out. Can you do that? Can you do that? He's not here right now. He left me alone in his conference room to think about what I've done. Meera, I think he wanted me to feel this way. I think watching me break down is part of his plan. And use that time to leave. Get in your car, drive anywhere public, and call me back when you're safe." There was a long pause, filled only with Priya's ragged breathing. "There are files here, Meera. folders with our names on them, files about grandmother, about Ma, about you. He's been documenting everything for decades. This isn't just about revenge anymore. I think he's been planning something bigger. Before I could respond, I heard a door open in the background. Samir's voice came through, smooth and cold. Priya, are you talking to someone? I thought we agreed you needed time alone to process. The line went dead. I tried calling back immediately, but Priya's phone went straight to voicemail. I tried 3 more times with the same result. Either she'd turned it off, or Samir had taken it from her. I was reaching for my laptop to call Karan when headlights swept across the sunroom windows again. But this time, it wasn't the black sedan. It was a police car, pulling into the bed and breakfast driveway with its lights off but its presence unmistakable. 2 officers stepped out, and through the window, I watched them approach the front door with the careful, deliberate movements of people who'd done this many times before. When they knocked, I knew exactly what Samir had done. He'd called the police, probably claiming I was harassing him or stalking him or making threats. He was going to tie me up in legal complications while he finished whatever he had planned for Priya. I opened the door before they could knock a second time. Officers, I think I know why you're here, and I need to tell you about something much more serious that's happening right now. One of the officers, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, held up her hand. Miss Sharma, we're not here about harassment charges. We're here because someone called in a welfare check. They said you might be in danger from a man named Samir Kapoor who's been stalking your family for decades. I stared at her in confusion. Who called it in? Your mother, the other officer said, a younger man who looked barely 30. She provided quite a bit of documentation, actually. Security footage, phone records, emails going back years. She said she'd been too blind to see it before, but now she's terrified for both her daughter's safety. My mother had gone to the police. The woman who'd slapped me, fired me, and chosen my sister over me for 15 years had finally seen the truth and was trying to protect us. My sister is at Kapoor Consulting's office right now, I said, my words tumbling out rapidly. Samir has her, and I think he's planning something. We need to get her out of there immediately. The female officer's expression shifted from concern to action. She spoke into her radio, requesting immediate backup to Kapoor Consulting's address, while her partner called for additional units. Within minutes, we were in the back of their patrol car, racing down the mountain road toward Mumbai with lights flashing and sirens wailing. I called Karan and asked him to meet us there with every piece of evidence we had. This was about to become very public very quickly, and I wanted to make sure the truth came out completely. The drive took 43 minutes. That felt like 43 hours. When we finally pulled up to the gleaming glass tower that housed Kapoor Consulting, there were already 3 other police vehicles waiting. My mother stood near one of them, wrapped in a shawl despite the warm night, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. When she saw me, she ran toward the car before the officers could even open my door. Mira, Priya's still up there. He won't let her leave. The building security tried to check on her, but Samir said she's there voluntarily, and they can't enter without a warrant. I turned to the officers. You have enough for a warrant? The female officer nodded grimly. Your mother provided documentation of decades of stalking and harassment. Combined with the partnership fraud and corporate sabotage evidence, we have more than enough. Judge Singh issued the warrant 20 minutes ago. We entered the building as a group, 8 police officers, my mother, Karan with his files and computer, and me. The building security didn't even try to stop us. They looked relieved to have the situation taken out of their hands. Kapoor Consulting occupied the entire 23rd floor. The elevator ride felt eternal, my mother gripping my hand with surprising strength while tears streamed silently down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. I should have listened to your grandmother. I should have protected you both. I let him poison everything because I was too weak and too proud to see the truth. We'll deal with that later, I said, not ready to forgive, but willing to focus on the immediate crisis. Right now, we get Priya safe. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area that was unsettlingly quiet. The lights were on, but no staff were visible. The police officers fanned out immediately, checking rooms with practiced efficiency. "Conference room C," one officer called out. "The door's locked from the inside." We rushed down the hallway to find a solid wood door with frosted glass panels. Through the glass, I could see two silhouettes. One sitting, one standing. "Samir Kapoor, this is the Mumbai police," the lead officer announced. "We have a warrant. Open this door immediately." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Samir's voice came through, muffled but clear. "Of course, officer. There's been some misunderstanding, but I'm happy to cooperate." The door opened to reveal Samir Kapoor in person for the first time in my life. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired and distinguished, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. He looked like a successful businessman, not a predator who'd spent decades destroying people. Behind him, Priya sat at the conference table, her face blotchy from crying, her hands shaking as she gripped a folder. "Priya," I said, moving past Samir toward my sister. "Ms. Sharma, please don't interfere with a business consultation," Samir said smoothly. "Your sister came here voluntarily to discuss matters related to Malhotra Restaurant Group, as is my contractual right to." "You have no contractual right to hold her against her will," the lead officer interrupted. "Miss Priya Malhotra, are you here of your own free will? Do you want to leave?" Priya stood on shaking legs. "Yes, I want to leave." He showed me. "I want to leave." He showed me everything he's done to our family. He's been planning this since before I was born. She held up the folder she'd been gripping. "This is his acquisition plan for Malhotra Restaurant Group. It's scheduled to execute next week. He's been working with 4 board members who don't know they're being manipulated. He has forged documents that will make it look like grandmother owed him money. He's planned every step of how to destroy us, and he showed it to me like he was proud of it." Samir's smooth expression finally cracked, revealing something cold and ugly beneath. "That's confidential business information. If you remove those documents, I'll sue for theft of intellectual property." "Sue all you want," Karan stepped forward, holding up his laptop, "because I have evidence that your entire consulting business is a front for corporate espionage and fraudulent acquisition schemes. I have testimony from 11 companies you've destroyed using the same tactics, and I have proof that you've been systematically harassing the Malhotra family for 28 years. The lead officer moved to take Priya's arm gently, guiding her away from Samir toward where my mother and I stood. As soon as she was within reach, my mother grabbed her and held her tightly, both of them crying. "Samir Kapoor," the officer said, "you're under arrest for criminal harassment, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent." I watched them handcuff him, this man who'd haunted my family for nearly 3 decades, who'd likely killed my grandmother, who turned my sister into a weapon and my mother into an accomplice. As they led him away from the elevator, he turned back to look at me one last time. "Your grandmother thought she could escape me too," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Look how that turned out." The implications of that statement, a near confession to murder, hung in the air. The officer gripping his arm tightened her hold. "Add threatening statements to the list." After they took Samir away, the 4 of us, my mother, Priya, Karan, and I, stood in that conference room, surrounded by evidence of decades of stalking and manipulation. Priya handed me the folder she'd been holding, and I flipped through page after page of Samir's meticulous planning. He'd mapped out every step of how he would destroy us, complete with timelines, financial projections, and psychological assessments of each family member's weaknesses. There was a file on me, dated from my teenage years forward, noting my excessive competence and immunity to traditional manipulation tactics. He'd written that I was the primary obstacle and that removing her influence on Priya is essential to the plan's success. He'd been planning my downfall specifically for over 15 years. "How did you know?" I asked my mother. "What made you finally see it?" She sank into one of the conference room chairs, looking exhausted. "After you left, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything that had happened, and I finally read grandmother's journals that Rajesh had been keeping safe. She'd left them with him before she died, with instructions to give them to me if anything happened to her." My mother's voice broke. She documented everything. 28 years of Samir's stalking, his threats, his manipulation. She tried to warn me multiple times, and I didn't listen. I was so flattered that someone successful wanted to help me, so eager to believe I could be a great leader like her, that I let him use me to hurt my own daughters. "He's very good at what he does," Karan said quietly. "I've been researching him for hours, and his methods are sophisticated. He identifies people's deepest insecurities and positions himself as the solution. By the time they realize what's happening, they're already complicit in their own destruction." "I destroyed everything," Priya said, her voice small and broken. 15 years of Mira's work, and I destroyed it all because I was desperate to matter. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw not the rival I'd been competing against, but the victim she'd been all along. Samir had identified a lonely young woman, desperate for approval, and had molded her into exactly the weapon he needed. "You were manipulated," I said. "We all were in different ways. The question now is what we do next." The legal proceedings took 4 months. Samir was charged with criminal harassment, corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit fraud, and after forensic analysis of my grandmother's case was reopened, criminally negligent homicide in connection with her death. New evidence emerged that the gas leak that had killed her had been caused by tampered equipment, and Samir's own files contained notes about eliminating the primary obstacle. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and ordered to pay 16 crore rupees in restitution to the families and companies he destroyed. Kapoor Consulting was dissolved, its assets seized and distributed among his victims. The damage he'd done to Malhotra Restaurant Group was extensive. 3 of our 5 locations had to be closed due to the contract losses and financial instability. The remaining 2 were operating at barely break-even levels. The company my grandmother had built over 40 years was on the edge of complete collapse. The board asked me to return as CEO with full authority to restructure as needed. I accepted, but with conditions that made some of them uncomfortable. I wanted complete transparency, an independent ethics board, a whistleblower protection system, and most importantly, I wanted my mother to step down from all operational roles. She agreed without hesitation. "I've done enough damage," she said at the board meeting where we formalized the changes. "Mira should have been leading this company for the past 10 years. I'm sorry it took a disaster for me to see that." Priya took a leave of absence to undergo therapy and work on rebuilding herself outside of the family business. She sent me letters sometimes, long handwritten notes apologizing and updating me on her progress. She'd started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping other victims of manipulation identify abusive patterns. "I need to learn who I am when I'm not trying to impress anyone," she wrote in one letter. "Maybe someday I can come back and actually contribute something real, but not until I'm sure I'm doing it for the right reasons." The restructuring of Malhotra Restaurant Group took 2 years. I downsized us from an attempted empire to a focused boutique operation. 2 excellently run restaurants with trained staff, sustainable practices, and menus that honored my grandmother's vision while incorporating modern techniques. I used my connections from the Shakti Women's Culinary Fund to bring in talented women chefs who'd been overlooked by the industry. I implemented profit-sharing programs that gave every employee ownership in our success. And I established the Savitri Malhotra Foundation using a portion of the restitution money Samir had been ordered to pay, dedicated to helping women entrepreneurs escape predatory business relationships. 3 years after the slap that changed everything, I stood in the kitchen of our flagship restaurant during the dinner rush, watching my team work with the kind of synchronized efficiency that comes from mutual respect and shared purpose. The dining room was full. The reviews were excellent, and for the first time in my professional life, I felt like I was building something that would last. My mother came by sometimes, no longer as an owner, but as a customer who'd finally learned to appreciate good food without needing to control how it was made. We'd rebuilt a relationship, not the mother-daughter bond of my childhood fantasies, but something more honest. She was in therapy, working on understanding how her own insecurities had made her vulnerable to Samir's manipulation. Priya returned to the company after 18 months, but not as an executive. She started as a host, greeting customers, managing reservations, learning the business from the ground up without the pressure of having to be visionary or bold. She was good at it. She had a warmth with people that I'd never appreciated before, because I'd been too busy resenting her for the favoritism she'd received. "I like this better," she told me one evening after the last customers had left. "I spent so many years trying to be you, trying to prove I was just as smart and capable. Now I'm just trying to be useful. It's freeing." The bed and breakfast in La Novola became my weekend retreat, a place I'd escape to when the city felt too crowded and the memories felt too heavy. I'd sit in that same sunroom where I'd watched everything collapse and rebuild, drinking coffee and reviewing proposals for the foundation, deciding which woman entrepreneur would be next to receive support. On the anniversary of the slap, exactly 4 years later, I received a letter from Samir in prison. I held it in my hands for a long time, remembering the last letter I'd received from him, the one I'd shredded without reading. This time, curiosity won. The letter was brief. "You were always the one I underestimated. Your grandmother knew you'd be the one to stop me. She was right. I spent 30 years planning revenge, and in the end, all I accomplished was proving that some people can't be broken. I hope that brings you satisfaction." It didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought me sadness for all the wasted years, all the damage done, all the potential destroyed because one man couldn't accept that he'd lost. But it also brought me clarity. I'd spent so much of my life trying to earn love from people who didn't know how to give it, trying to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I wasn't valuable. The slap had been the best thing that ever happened to me, because it had freed me to finally choose myself. I framed a photograph of my grandmother and hung it in my office at the restaurant. Not the formal portrait my mother had favored, but a candid shot of her in the kitchen, flour on her hands, laughing at something someone had said. That was the legacy I wanted to honor. Not perfection or power, but joy in the work and kindness to the people who shared it. And that's where my story ends. But maybe yours is just beginning. If you've ever felt undervalued, overlooked, or trapped in a situation where people refuse to see your worth, tell me in the comments. What would you do if you were in my position? Would you have left sooner? Or would you have stayed and fought differently? Your stories matter. Your voice matters. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who will never appreciate you and build something so beautiful they'll spend years regretting what they lost. If these words reach you, if you understand what it means to finally choose yourself, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Tell me which city you're from so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. Because the empire I built wasn't based on fear or revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was built on the quiet, determined belief that women's competence, when finally unleashed from manipulation and given room to flourish, can transform everything. My grandmother had known that all along. I just needed 36 years, a slap, a resignation, and a war to finally understand it myself. The restaurant is thriving. The foundation is growing. My sister is healing. And I smile now, not the brief, hidden smile from the day of the slap, when I knew my plan was finally beginning, but something deeper and more genuine. The smile of someone who transformed their greatest wound into their most powerful legacy. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.